It's really a book where I was kind of trying to find all the things that I love reading and just shove them into one book and make it really a comfort read. But for me, a comfort read often involves like some amount of bloodshed and also some amount of like intense thinking about serious ideas. So I'm hoping that it's like a nice, warm, swaddled, intellectual gut punch.
Hello and welcome to this special author interview for FanFiAddict. I'm Frasier Armitage, reviewer for FanFiAddict.com and Sci-Fi author. And joining me today is the magnificently talented author Malka Older. Malka, welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm great, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Really looking forward to having a chat with you about the Mimicking of Known Successes. For those who don't know Malka, she's the author of the Centenal Cycle, which includes Infomocracy, Null States, and State Tectonics. But her latest novella is The Mimicking of Known Successes. Malka, tell us a little bit about what this book is and what people can expect from it.
So this book is a murder mystery and romance that's set on Jupiter. So it's also science fiction. And it's really a book where I was kind of trying to find all the things that I love reading and just shove them into one book and make it really a comfort read. But for me, a comfort read often involves like some amount of bloodshed and also some amount of like intense thinking about serious ideas. So I'm hoping that it's like a nice, warm, swaddled, intellectual gut punch. But that's what I was going for.
I love that sentence. Like a comfort read involves bloodshed. That's just like that's great.
I mean,
Um,
sometimes the bad guys just gotta get got.
yeah, it's true. It's true. With it being like it's a passion project, right? Because you poured your all of the things that you love that you're passionate about into this book. How important do you think it is for us to write our passions and to live our passions?
I think it's super important. And I also think like I would almost say too, for me it was like I reached a point where I was like, there are things that I love reading and I don't really care if whatever if those aren't the things that are considered deep or important. I love reading them. That's also what I want to write right now. I think I started writing this towards the end of 2020. So like obviously it had been a rough year for everyone. And I had done a lot of comfort reading. And so I'd done a lot of thinking about how important that is, to have places you can go in your mind that are, again, not necessarily completely cozy. Sometimes they are, and cozy reads are absolutely great. But sometimes, there were reads like when I count up my comfort reads, they include like Murderbot, which not only has a lot of violence in it, but also deals with really serious and scary and sometimes depressing issues, but deals with it in such a way that I'm always happy to go back because the voice is so just welcoming in a weird, non-welcoming way, in a very relatable, non-welcoming way. Or I think also of like T. Kingfisher's sort of slightly horror tinged, but really fun adventure romances. So I'm not necessarily talking about books that avoid all difficult subjects, although sometimes those are really needed too. But I'm also talking about books that just um, find a lot of pleasure in the acts of creating a character and creating a world and bringing you into that world and telling a story that's really satisfying. Sometimes, again, without like vengeance note, and sometimes just with something that's super engaging and interesting. So I think for me, that was why I was like, okay, I want it to be a mystery because those, when I'm feeling really stressed or down or concerned about something in the real world, a mystery can really help to pull me in and keep me in the fictional world. And I wanted it to have that romance element because romance books are often really lovely and often also really get at, super important issues, but in that sort of somewhat comforting way. And I wanted it to be science fiction because I don't know, I have all these big ideas swirling around in my head, and it just made sense to me. So yeah, it was something where I made my NaNoWriMo project for that year. It was blank, but make it fun. I was like, I'm just going to write the book that is going to make me happy while I'm writing it, because we just all needed some happiness and some joy right then.
Totally, totally. Is science fiction your, the place that you go to for happiness and joy? It because obviously you as a writer, you can write in any genre. What is it that appeals to you about sci-fi?
I mean, I do write in other genres, and I certainly read in a bunch of genres. So I wouldn't say that science fiction is necessarily the place I go. There's a lot of science fiction that is my happy place, and that is where I go. Or maybe we can say even more broadly speculative fiction. But I do read sort of non-speculative romance, I guess, and I read literary fiction, as it's called, which I think is a terrible genre title, but and I read mysteries that are not science fiction. I read really, really widely, and I think um, as useful as these genre labels can be, there's also there's so much that they miss. Like science fiction can be really anywhere on the range of. I mean, it's so much stuff. Whether you're talking about tone, whether you're talking about the shape of the story that's set in a science fictional world, whether you're talking about something that's near future science fiction or totally, so far future that it might as well be fantasy. There's just a ton in there. So, I think for me, and that's why when I when I look at my sort of comfort reads, they really run the gambit of different genres, and it comes back to voice, and it comes back to the tone, and what makes a book fun. I think fun is a really underrated characteristic for books and movies right now, because we have this sort of cultural tilt that things that are grimdark or grinding, or at least have like really serious moments in them, are somehow more important and more valuable. And again, this is not to say that I don't like those. I often really like reading something that will make me cry, or something that really takes you through it to get to the end, or something that just gives you a portrait of, you know, important, terrible things that are happening and that you need to know about. But that's not the only way to do to relate something that's fundamentally important about our life and our world. There's lots of joy and fun going on in the world, and that is also really important, and also really hard to write about. So, I just want to kind of balance that a little bit. And certainly, I think in moments where there's a lot of dark stuff going around us, for some people, it's cathartic to read really even darker stuff in their life. And for me, I kind of like to read happy things for a while.
Yeah, and part of what makes this book so much fun for me, and how you totally nailed it as far as making it a comfort read, is is the style that it's written in. So to me, I enjoy the classics. I like classic literature. I like classics of sci-fi, and this book kind of feels like it could sit alongside those kind of like classics. Um, it doesn't feel like an old-fashioned book. It just feels like it's written in this really awesome style, and that just for me feels really comforting. How did you get into the mindset of writing that? Were you like listening to music as you wrote it to get you into that mindset, or watching TV, or just, it's that from that kind of era reading books? How did you write this? How did you pull it off?
Oh, thank you. I mean, that's really high praise, and I appreciate it. I think it's a bit of a combination. On the one hand, I certainly read a lot of books from like kind of golden era detective literature. A lot of Sayers and Tay and Wentworth, and Marsh, um, and enjoyed a lot of them. Although there's a lot of problematic stuff in them as well. And stuff that just kind of really jerks you back. And also, in some of them, there's just a very different conception of sort of what makes a mystery or a plot or a romance, for that matter. Um, and so part of it was kind of having that language, and I think I also had a lot of that language, or I have it in my head from reading a lot of those classics when I was a kid. Right? Not so much the golden age detectives, although I read some, but also just generally like things from that era, like Anne of Green Gables um, and Jane Eyre, and Jane Austen, and so on. So I have kind of a reservoir of that. And then again, when I wrote this book, I'm doing something here where it's a funny sort of retrofuturism, right? It's set on Jupiter. It's set several hundred years in the future. It's quite a bit more in the future than the Infomocracy series. But for various reasons, this future resembles in some ways the world of Sherlock Holmes, let's say. It's very foggy because it's a gas giant. They use gaslighting, ditto. They use a lot of fires for warmth, same. And also long distance telecommunications don't really work very well, and they travel on trains. And so there's this kind of like mirroring in a bit. Not that everything is the same. I don't think that this is like Victorian England in social ways at all, or in many other ways. But there is this atmosphere, right? And so as I was thinking about how to write the characters, part of me kind of leaned toward that language, and part of me was also thinking, this is very far in the future. People are going to speak very differently then, and I don't feel particularly either qualified to or good at imagining the way people talk in the future. Like, I don't want to write some sort of cyberpunk slang that is going to not hit or be incomprehensible. But I felt like writing a language that was somewhat tilted towards the past kind of helped get that along, that concept of like, there's a little bit of distance here. The people are talking and thinking a little bit differently than we do, but hopefully it's more or less comprehensible because it's familiar to us mostly from the past. I also threw in a ton of words from other languages whenever I felt like it. And again, it kind of came back to me being like, I want to write what I want on this book, and a lot of that is language too. Like I said, I have a lot of language in my head from reading old books and different books when I was little. A lot of different languages floating around in here from various places that I've lived or worked or studied. And so when I found a word that fit better what I wanted to say, even if it was in a different language, or even if it wasn't the word that would normally be picked, or if it's a very antiquated word, or if it's a very modern word, but I wanted it in this somewhat antiquated language, I put it in. And fortunately, I have a great editor, Brent Lambert, and great copy editors and publishers at Tor.com who were very supportive of like, mess with language any way you want. So there's a lot of fun stuff linguistically in there, I think.
Yeah, I really loved a lot of like the plays on words that you did as well, like the mausoleum, which comes up a number of times through the book. I thought that was classic. That was brilliant.
Thank
But,
you. That was one of the first parts of the book I wrote, and I was like, the pun, the pun. It was just, I couldn't let go of it because it was fun, and naming the
yeah,
rest
because
always fun, and I wanted it to be a really fun book.
it is. It's a brilliant book. It's one of those books which is hopeful and it's charming. And that's the aspect of the classics that really sort of like for me really stand out, because a lot of that kind of classic literature, like you said, it's problematic in so many ways that I think an awful lot of modern readers are kind of not steering towards them anymore because they don't want to be triggered by anything. But there's a hopefulness and like an innocence and like a, you know, that kind of style that is so refreshing, and you're bringing that potentially to a whole new audience of people because there's nothing problematic about your book. It's just
I hope.
brilliant fun from start to end.
I mean,
So
I'm sure that in the future people might find things, but I'm trying, and yeah, I hope so. I really, I tried to care about the characters a lot, and I think that there's like when I talk about Sayers, for example, being problematic. On the one hand, there's certain words and slurs that she uses that are just really terrible to read as a modern reader. And I will say she tends to put them in the mouths of people who are not like the main character or the heroes, and it's kind of showing them up a bit. But it's still really, really jarring and horrible to read. And so there's a historical aspect to it. So like people really felt okay about saying this. in public, and then, okay, that's changed. And there's something, to that. But there's also, underlying it, a very deep sense of sort of class and of certain people being a certain way. Conan Doyle is even worse. Like Conan Doyle, I don't know if he ever actually spoke to a real foreigner in real life, like any foreigner, not just someone of color, but, even his people from the colonies who are white are like super duper cartoons. And obviously, like, he must have spoken to women, but he probably didn't listen to them when they spoke back. So, there's a lot of stuff in there that's just kind of baffling for us to read. And and I think that one of the helpful things, and like I said, I'm sure I have messed up somewhere because we are all stuck in our times. But I do think that one of the helpful things of writing in the science fiction or fantasy or other speculative fiction modes is that you do try to get out of your time. You try to look at what a society might be like if it were different. Um, and I think being able to take that step out and back, as opposed to being like, oh, I'm going to report my society the way it is. And not only am I going to report the distasteful things in a way that maybe shows them distasteful, but I'm also going to sort of just plop down all my assumptions. I think we try, I hope, when we're writing science fiction or fantasy to get out far enough to question some of those assumptions. And and hopefully that gives the book that kind of vibrancy and a bit of difference. So yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, it really feels like it's got all of the best aspects of it. So it's kind of like introducing that experience of reading a classic without any of the bad negative bits as well. So it's kind of like you're kind of sharing the experience of what it's like as a reader of these works. You, as a writer, you're kind of pouring that experience into what you're creating. Do you think that that's part of a job of a writer, to share experience and to the things that you take in, to be able to then put that out there into the world?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, we are writing as a way of communicating, as a way of kind of proving to each other that the individual, our own headspace is not the only thing that exists, that there are other people out there who think and feel. It's a fundamental thing for empathy, which goodness knows we need more of in this world. And so I think, writing and reading widely and trying to live other people's experience in this partial but often really immersive way is just so important. Um, it's funny how now there's this whole idea of VR and AR and meta, and I don't know what it's going to take for those to get anywhere near the way it feels to be really immersed in reading a good book that gets you into someone else's head.
Mm, yeah, that's a really, really good observation. I think one of the things that I really liked talking about this idea of, science fiction being for everybody is some of the character themes that are in this book, because it's an awful lot with the characters about, there's an idea of reconciliation here, and like overcoming, difficulties. Um, do you think that that is also kind of like a reflection of what science fiction can do? Is it reconciliatory? Can it help to overcome some of the social differences that we experience in the world today?
Yeah, I hope so. And I mean, again, I think you have to be careful because science fiction can absolutely work both ways. Any tool really. Books. We like to think of books as a neutral good, but they have often been used for evil. And the same with radio, and the same with anything that you pick. Science fiction and other speculative narratives. I teach a course. It's just starting right now, uh, in its third iteration, about predictive fictions, which is sort of comparing speculative fiction to the supposedly nonfiction predictions of the future that we're given all the time, like the weather report or the economic forecast or product launch forecasts or polling or whatever. And so I try to make the point that we give way too much weight to some of these quantitative and impersonal forms of thinking about the future, and not enough to narratives. But At the same time, when we look at narratives, we have to be just as rigorous as we are when we look at the methodology for some quantitative study, because it's very easy for narratives to influence the agenda, just as it's very easy for quantitative ones like a cost benefit analysis to really push people towards believing there's more benefit to cost. Right. So it's both ways, but we need to think rigorously about narratives because they will always have some kind of agenda that's always coming from an individual person. And if it's coming from a chatbot, believe me, it's still going to have agendas baked in there because that chatbot is still coming from people, and still making choices about what it has sampled from. But you know, it's to say that something has an agenda is not to immediately be able to discount it. Uh, but we need to be conscious as readers a little bit of what we're ingesting and thinking about, what are the things what are the areas that this is pushing to. And I think science fiction can be amazing for helping us think in different ways, for helping us see from different viewpoints, for helping us imagine ourselves out of the specific place and time that we're in and all the assumptions, the constraints, the givens that come with that. But it can also definitely express hatred and express resentment and express ideas of superiority in subtle ways that are very dangerous. We can certainly see, like, if you look, just to take one really easy example, I think movies tend to be a bit worse on this. Not always, but in a general way, mostly because they're designed to make money and need investors to get made at all, so that there's like this extra sort of I mean, books do too, but especially with self-publishing to a lesser extent. Uh, and so, if you look at the way that AI is portrayed in movies, it's pretty both unrealistic and terrible. It's very gendered. It's very racialized. It's very just has very little to do with what's actually going on. And so we see the repercussions of that today in the way that the discussions about AI chatbots and other forms of AI are happening now. That there isn't the kind of mass understanding of what we're really talking about, because it's all informed by this popular entertainment that often makes the AI seem like something really different from where we are with it right now, at least. And does have those implications for human beings because it is so often gendered, or because it is so often put in a certain class position. So yeah, I think it has great potential, but it also has great danger. To have a very long-winded answer to your question.
Well, it's a brilliant answer because it just goes to show how, as well as how sort of freeing writing science fiction can be, you also have to be very careful about the way in which you approach it. One of the things about your approach in setting this story into the far future, as opposed to it being a traditional Holmesian tale set back in Victorian times, is that, a Victorian story, you are totally constrained by having to do loads of research into it, by the setting and the narrative. This totally frees you up setting it on Jupiter in the future. But I was curious, sort of, what was your approach towards sort of research? Was there anything that you had to research for this project specifically that you wouldn't have sort of necessarily thought at the time? Oh, I can set it in the future. This is going to be great. No rules. Did you hit any like hurdles with that when it came to approaching the future on Jupiter?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely did. I definitely think that way. Like, I definitely was like, yeah, Jupiter, we don't know much about that. I can make some stuff up. But I try not to contradict too much the things that we do know. And so, like, at some point as I was working on it, and I was already in the book quite a way, and I remember wondering, I wonder how long a day is on Jupiter. And I looked it up and realized that a day on Jupiter is like 10 hours, like a day and night together is 10 hours. And I was like, oh, no, I have to address that, because that is not, that's something people would have to adjust to. So I have a whole section in the book. I mean, hopefully scattered sections. So I had to like go back and really think, like, how do people deal with having 5 hour day, 5 hour night? Um, and I also, I wanted to make sure that I was sort of given the atmosphere. So I had to think a bit about what it was like having so many moons in the sky. And in book 2, actually, they go to Io, which is where Maso was born, and so then I had to look up, like gravity differences, and Io is tidally locked with Jupiter, but not with the sun. So there's like a whole, it's just, there's a lot of there actually. So I hope I didn't make any too big screamers, but there was a lot of fun stuff, and it can be really generative in a creative sense when you look these things up, because yeah, I mean, having to figure out a whole different diurnal pattern for humans meant it gave me some really interesting world building details.
And how much fun was it building the world? Because I just get the sense from this that you had so much fun, like with
So
the platforms and like even the way that the animals are talked about, and it's so cool to read. And I loved building it in my head. What was it like to write?
it was so much fun. And again, this was me sort of leaning into the fun and being like, if I feel like having this kind of food, they're going to eat this kind of food. And if I feel like a long train ride, but I want the seats to be heated. And I also want there to be, a cafe car. And it's, and it's kind of, and I want there to be a really bad storm that's isolating and foggy and rainy, but they're going to be cozy and warm. Um, and I want this to be an interesting world with lots of different platforms that have kind of developed their own culture, and there's going to be architectural styles. Yeah, I love all this stuff. I really do. And so, coming up with ideas for what the architecture on Jupiter might have looked like 100 years before the story takes place, um, and using it to sort of comment a little bit on how we revere certain styles of architecture and consider them very like academic. Uh, and just thinking about those things, I love all of that kind of detail, and getting my fingers really into the world building, and the food, thinking about the food, and what people would eat and what they would call the restaurants, and what the libraries would be like. I had a ton of fun with the university, and just thinking about this university that is in some ways very like an elite university here, and in some ways just so different, because the whole like raison d'etre is totally different, and the faculties are different. And so yeah, it was a blast. And that's part of why I'm writing sequels, is because it's a big world, there's a lot to explore, and it's so much fun doing it.
What's really cool about how you wrote it as well is how much variety. So basically, they're all existing on these platforms that orbit the planet, but how much variety you're able to create in there, like with Valdegeld and with even the start of the book being this very distant platform. Um, I loved how much you were able to sort of build an entire world out of this, as opposed to it just being one setting. It's I thought that was great. Um, with regard to the actual world building versus character building element of it, one of the other things I really loved is how you made the fantastical mundane. Like, you've got this, you start the book with like this train journey over Jupiter, and you go into like the farthest part of it, and the character's like, like just, oh, this really super long journey. In my head, I'm like, wow, this is fantastic. For the characters, it's like, oh, not another long trip across the planet. So how useful is that as a technique when it comes to character building and world building, and is that where they kind of meet, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I start a book, I always spend a lot of time before I really have any idea what the plot's going to be like in specific terms. I knew I wanted a murder mystery. I knew I wanted some kind of academic thing going on, but I didn't know much else. But I just spend a lot of time with the characters in the setting, and just trying to figure out how they interact. If I have this kind of character on this kind of place, what are they going to do in their free time? And it's I don't I think it'd be probably good to have exercises where I ask myself these questions, but mostly I just sort of think about it at night as I'm lying in bed and going, oh, this would be a fun thing to do, or that, oh, this would be the kind of, oh, it's a university. They've got to have a sport. They've got to have a sport that's like kind of prestigious, and all the universities compete, and it has to come from their world. So this is for Booktube, but so it's going to have something to do with like magnetized shoes skating around on rails in a circle, and so I just kind of think of these things and throw them on a page, and then when I have enough, I realize that I know the characters pretty well, and I know the setting kind of well, and then I have a better idea of what the plot's going to look like. So yeah, so it's a constant interaction and sort of thinking about backstory. Where does Mosa come from? And oh, people from Io are looked down on a little bit on Jupiter. So how does that affect her? And how does that affect the way other people act towards her? And Platy comes from a farming platform, and now she's a scholar. Is that really unusual? Just a little unusual? And just sort of think back and forth about these things.
The characters of Mossa and Platy, they are such unique and individual characters, but they're kind of fulfilling the Holmes Watson dynamic and the role. Is there a challenge there in creating a character that's original, but that also you're kind of pulling from something that is so iconic when it comes to the dynamics between them? Are there challenges involved with that?
A little bit, but I think not too much, because it's I thought a lot about why I like Holmesian retelling so much, and there are a lot of really great ones out there. I'm rereading Sherry Thomas's Lady Sherlock series right now, because the new one just came out today, and it's so great in how she sort of takes this dynamic apart and puts it back together. But there are lots of other examples from the Mary Russell and Sherlock Holmes books, which I love. Catherine Addison's Angel of Crows, which is just a fascinating, weird retelling. And Alexis Hall did one too. So there's a whole bunch of really cool stuff out there around this dynamic, and I always really loved it. It really attracts my attention when I see something come out, and I was wondering about that, and so I started to think about what it is about this dynamic that appeals to me, and I decided a lot of it has to do with kind of the fact that one of the characters sees the world in a very different way. Um, so there's a neurodivergence thing, and it has advantages and disadvantages, much like narrative disorder in Infomocracy. It's a bit of a theme. And then you have this other character who's very close to them and who, in some ways, is a conduit to the world, because they're kind of like a bridge. They often have a little bit of something themselves, being a bit different, but not in the same way, not to the same degree. And there is this tension between the two, and having different things to contribute to their common enterprise. And then often this kind of relationship too that sometimes is completely platonic, but a very close friendship, and sometimes it has this romantic tension to it as well. And so having this in my head is like, okay, this is part of why I love these stories, and that's what I want. But I also reread the Sherlock Holmes stories as I was working on this, and there's good things about those stories, but Sherlock Holmes is really awful to Watson a lot, and Watson is really dopey a lot of the time, especially around women. Um, and so, it's very easy for me to say like, it's going to have these elements I like, but they're also going to be very, very different. And once I kind of had those parameters in my head to just let the characters develop, as I said, from the setting and kind of from what I wanted to, I have to spend a lot of time with these characters, and I really only like reading books where I enjoy spending time with the characters. So I wanted to make sure that they would be characters I wanted to spend time with. That they were flawed, but definitely people who have interesting thoughts and interesting reactions and are trying to do good.
Yeah, that's really cool. So I just finished watching, sort of rewatching Sherlock, and then just finished watching Elementary, just as I picked up the book. So I kind of went from binging all of this like modern Holmes adaptation, sort of like on TV, to then imagining it in like a far future setting. And it's really interesting that what you say, that there doesn't seem to be a time period where this dynamic doesn't work. It's like, it's kind of, you can set it anywhere. You could probably set it in like ancient Egypt, and it would still be awesome and really compelling. So it's really interesting you saying about that there are things that you can draw on, as a writer to make something compelling, but you don't want to be stuck in that mold. I think you really pulled it off with this book. Totally. It's, yeah. With regard to like the mystery aspect of it, I once heard an anecdote, and I haven't been able to confirm it anywhere, so this might be complete rubbish that I'm spouting. But I once heard this anecdote that Conan Doyle used to structure his books by coming up with a problem and then figuring out how to solve it. Whereas someone like Agatha Christie, he commented, did the opposite. She started with the solution to a problem and then worked backwards. In regards to like the structure of how you put the mystery together, what approach did you take, and what kind of, would you do it differently if you had to do it again?
Okay, well, I am doing it again with book 3 right now after doing it with book 2. And I usually don't know what's going to happen. And I don't know if this is a good thing or not. But as I said, like for when I write books, and this is how I wrote the Infomocracy books too, gosh, I remember with the last one in the series, State Tectonics, I was like, I had like 10% left to write, and I knew I was almost at the end. I'd written the very, very end, and I didn't know what was going to happen in this last. Usually I know before I get to the last 10%, but it's, yeah, I kind of tend to figure it out as I go. And that sometimes leads to like a lot of revision. And but it's not exactly working on vibes, but there's a sort of vibes element to it in the sense that there are elements that I want to have in the book. So like, this one, um, actually, so the very beginning, this guy missing off the platform, I wrote the prologue after I'd written most of the rest of it. And I wanted to have a beginning that got right into the mystery. And I was actually very inspired for that by Anne Leckie's Ancillary Justice, because it starts with finding a body in the snow, a naked body in the snow. And then it turns out that the body is not dead and that there's no mystery because the narrator knows who the person is exactly. And they put some clothes on them and go on with the story. But it's a really great hook. And actually a really nice sort of twist in telling you have no idea what's going on here. And so I kind of just had that inspiration of like, okay, someone's missing, and we're going to start with that, and then we're going to work around to figuring it out. And yeah, and then as I go on, I'm like, I think someone else needs to get killed. It just feels like it's the right time for it. And this is very much to my narrative disorder of like, okay, I've read a ton of books in very different styles, and I have a lot of different kind of templates in my head, and I don't want to work from one template, but I do like drawing from different ones and kind of having that sense of rhythm, of okay, now I'm not sure we know enough about the character relationship at this point. How can we put a little bit of that in, or we need to keep moving things along here. Let's have a trip. Let's have a revelation. And just kind of figure it out that way. And at some point in this noodling, I usually realize what the solution is. So basically, if you didn't figure out the answer to the mystery by the end, you're not alone. I didn't either.
I love that. That's great. The with that approach though, do you find like that you'll start out and then you'll realize, oh, hang on, I haven't started in the right place here? Do you end up having to constantly sort of like figure out where to start the book?
Um, I mean, as I said, I wrote the prologue later in this case, so sometimes, and sometimes the beginning is pretty solid, but there's stuff in the middle where I have to go back and like plant something so it makes sense later. Or I need to make sure that I mention something, or I have a whole twist that I need to justify or get rid of, one or the other. So I do, there, like I said, there's a lot of revision that happens in the process when you do it in this pantsing way. But I enjoy it a lot, and I prefer kind of figuring things out as I go than writing an outline dryly. I know other people do it differently and do that works for them wonderfully. Great. But for me, and I really like this process of sort of figuring things out slowly. Uh, I like the like drastic revisions that are necessary less, but it makes it possible for me, so it's fine.
I love that that's your that's what you're doing with it, that you're discovering the mystery along with everybody else. It must be so fun when you actually get to the solution. You think, aha, this is it. This is how it works. It's
It is. No, it's I did just have a moment like that for book 3 where I was like, "Oh, oh," and it is great. It's like, okay, that's and it's not always even like I've known who the bad guy is for a while on book 3, but it's like, oh, this is the dynamic that makes it make sense, and this is the intermediate step that's going to lead me to the show, the climactic crisis that I want to have. And yeah, once you kind of feel that whole chain and the whole shape of the book in your head, it's wonderful. So.
Yeah, it's my big problem, my biggest challenge with writing is getting the beginning right. So even when I outline and even when I've got the story and I know where it needs to begin, I guarantee that when I get to the end of the book, I'll have to rewrite the beginning about a dozen times just to figure out where to start it. It's the challenge. I think a lot of people talk about the middle as being the biggest challenge, but for me, it's the beginning. What's your biggest sort of when it comes to your writing? Is there a something that you consistently are trying to work on to try and improve as you write more, or have you kind of just got it where to the point where you've got it pretty solid across the board?
No, I definitely feel like there's always stuff to improve. I usually have an idea of the beginning. Like that's usually one of the early things that comes to me is kind of a scene. Like so in this one, I did write the prologue later, but the opening of chapter 1, where Plates arriving at the university, was one of the first things I wrote, even before I was sure it was going to be a murder mystery. I originally was like, maybe it's a academia thing. Um, but then I realized I wanted to combine them. And so, I had this idea of like coming back to a place that has big emotions tied to it on a train where you can see it from a distance, and then going through this city and how wonderful it is. Uh, Wonderful in a not all good, but very powerful way. And then, also for book 2, I was like, I want to show Platy like at the university at an academic event that's not like purely academic. Like she's at a lecture and there's food and it's somewhat modern and it's not totally job necessary, but she's supposed to enjoy it, but also she's distracted. It's that sort of thing is often very early um, in my process. What I think, what I feel like I try to improve on right now. Well, maybe this is just the scene that I have to write today in book 3, but things like ensemble, like pieces where you've got a lot of different characters and you want them all to be recognizable and different, and they all need to talk. So there has to be dialogue that feels natural, but also gets you somewhere, and it can't take up too much time. This is where I always feel like, uh, do I have to make this person say something again now? Or are they going to forget about this person? But also, if they talk, it's taking up so much space, and just trying to figure out, how to really balance um, an ensemble cast where without I think I tend to focus very much on my main characters and build them really strongly, but I want to make sure that I have um, groups for them and friends and other people who are around. So I've been trying to expand the cast in books 2 and 3, and make sure that there's a lot of other people who feel very real. And yeah, but especially in these scenes where there's a lot of them in one place is where I'm always like, juggle it.
Yeah, yeah, I like that. It is, you do feel like a juggler, I think, sometimes trying to, or a plate spinner, just constantly trying to spin the right plates. The thing that you were saying about before um about the characters, and about how you kind of like you build from the characters and you imagine their situation and you imagine their environment and everything like that. Do you find that that is more important to a storyteller to get the atmosphere right than it is to get the plot and the details and the inner workings of all of that right. In your mind, sort of, if for anybody who's listening and who's tuning in, who's just starting out on a writing journey, what kind of emphasis would you place on trying to write with an atmosphere as opposed to write with a plot?
I mean, I think it's different for everybody. And I don't really like to be prescriptive because not only do I not have the one good way to write, but I also don't have the one good way to read. So all I can do is try to write the kinds of books that I like to read. And I mean, I love a good plot and I love a plot that works tightly and everything. But I've noticed about myself that the books that I reread, the ones that I want to return to again and again, even once I know what's going to happen, it's because I enjoy spending time with the characters and I enjoy spending time in the place. And sometimes a lot of that place is the atmosphere, right? It's not necessarily something that you can put your finger on in a description, but it's the way the book is overall written that tells you, you know, this is a fun place to spend time, or this is, this gives you that creepy crawly feeling that you feel like right now, regardless of what's actually happening. There's so many ways for writers to convey that atmosphere. And again, not every atmosphere is right for every moment or for every person. But having noticed for myself that I want to go back and reread books to spend more time with characters, because knowing the characters that well, the joke is still funny, even though you know what the punchline is going to be, or the plot is still exciting, even though you know the end, because you are feeling with those characters, because you like spending time with them. Or, it's like visiting a city that you've been to before where you're like, I'm going to go back to that plaza because it's always got a good atmosphere and I like it. In a book, even though it's, obviously every time you go back to a city, it's not the same, but in the book, you're going back to it with a new mind that you've had other things happen. You might see something new in it, but you enjoy this scene, right? And you're looking forward to it even as you read. So thinking about that experience as a reader uh, makes me personally want to concentrate more on like having characters that people want to spend time with, having a place that they want to go back to, hopefully having sort of layers in the book that come out differently as people reread, whether because they know what's going to happen. And so things at the beginning ping in different ways, or just whether because, they've they've had things in their life in between and they go back and reread and they feel something different. But that's the kind of book that I like to come back to. I do appreciate plot a lot. I'm not sure that great characters in a great setting, I think they will still make me love the book with little or no plot, and I can think of a couple of examples of that. Um, but a plot that doesn't make sense will often throw me out just as much as a character that doesn't make sense. But like if you think about some of Sophia Samatar's books have very little plot. It's there, but like most of it is character and world building, and they're incredible, right? Or there's a book that I incredibly just love, one of my favorite books by Rabbi Halameddin called An Unnecessary Woman. And it has plot, but most of the joy in the book is the voice of the narrator, and the place that she is living is and describing um, her city, Beirut, and in this very just individual and wonderful way. And yeah, the plot is nice, but that character will make me come back to the book. That voice, that person, that life experience will make me come back to that book again and again.
Yeah, I think I'm the same. I think I love a good plot. I love when the plot absolutely sings and soars. But from a writing perspective, it's so much. I get so much more pleasure from writing a great character than I do from writing a great plot. So yeah, that really I totally relate to that, Malka. That's brilliant. You said that you were a teacher and that you teach. Um, but writing, I mean, I suppose the best teachers are also the best learners. Writing for me is very much a learning thing. Like I learn so much by writing. And is it nice to to have that aspect to still to be a learner, as well as sort of in your professional life being a teacher? Is does that make a nice balance for you?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think there's also the balance of like writing is for a lot of it very solitary, whereas teaching is very extroverted and very much like being on with people and interacting with people. And I like both of those things, but I like to have them in balance. So for me, it's really nice to have a balance between writing where I'm really in my head and like I don't share drafts too early, and it's kind of just, and then also doing something else that involves interacting with a lot of people um, in different ways. So yeah, I really like that balance. And as you say, writing, it very much feels like learning when you're discovering um, what's there. There's an image I think it's from Stephen King's On Writing about like unearthing a fossil. Like it's there in your head, but you have to kind of gently pick away everything else to feel the shape of it. So you're learning something, and then it's actually pretty great to be able to like have the process of learning being also the process of documenting, and then you can just sort of flip it out into the world without having to do too much. I mean, there's edits, which is a lot of it is the process of like, okay, this is clear to you in your head, but you also this for other people you need to do something else to clarify or shift this around. Um, but a lot of it is just sort of like, oh, I learned this cool thing. Look, and just it's all this way.
Yeah, and that's writing and accomplishing more than one thing at once is really, really, to me, science fiction and speculative fiction really helps with that. Like in Infomocracy, you have this really brilliant line that is, it's not, doesn't form like loads of the plot or anything, but it was just in there of about television being like the opiate of choice for a while. And it was this brilliant combination of like commentary and speculation. Do you find that with in the Mimicking of Known Success, because you do it in this book as well, do you find that that combination of commentary and speculation that there needs to be, we're talking about balance, does there need to be a balance with that as well, when you're in your mind with your writing?
Well, I do think that having stuff that has nothing to do with the plot is super important for world building, because I think if everything is plot bearing, it feels very mechanical. It feels like this entire world was built to support the plot. And so I am a person I have an associative mind in general. So I will think of sort of random things connected to other things. Um, or I just have a lot of thoughts in general and opinions. I have a lot of opinions. And I feel like, in my books, if I can figure out ways to kind of frame those opinions in the world, just putting them in, it gives it a more lived in feeling. It's uh, like, oh, this character has something in her background, and it's not a pure psychological A plus B equals she takes this act. It's she has a background that exists whether or not it influences the specific stuff happening in the book, or um, whatever it is that's this extra thing that if I can put in, I think it makes it feel much more real. And it lets me get some more of my ideas like out into the world. And I think that's what ideas want. So, um, when I wrote Infomocracy, I had all sorts of thoughts about like hotels that would want people to stay in them because those people would encourage other people to stay there. And, you know, um, ways to deal with fashion that were very different, or just different ideas that were random that did not have to be in there. But of course, I'm going to put them in there. Where else am I going to write this idea down? um, so yeah, I think it's both kind of a way for me to just use small thoughts that are not a full short story on their own, and really, really a way to make the worlds feel and the characters feel real and lived in, because they're not just unipurpose. They're like they've got these random things floating around like we all do.
Absolutely, that should be on a t-shirt or something about ideas want to be in the world. That's what they want. I love that so much. And with regard to what else is coming out into the world for you, um, what what can you tell us about what's coming next for Mossa and for Platy?
So we've already announced book 2, which is called The Imposition of Unnecessary Obstacles. You can draw from that title what you will. And it's coming out I think it's scheduled for February now. Hopefully we'll stick to that. So less than a year. I know it feels so long. Publishing just takes a long time, but less than a year. And it is another mystery. That is the mystery part is I think standalone, but I tried to build on the world and the relationships. I'm really interested in romance of like looking beyond that first kind of we're coming together and thinking about the romance of continuing relationships. Not just like a portrayal of a continuing relationship, but like how there are romantic moments in it, how there's doubt and uncertainty, which underpins the sort of romance of do they really want me, do they not? And then um, and then various happy for now, I guess, stages along the way. But just really interested in kind of pushing relationships beyond that first kind of coming together. But also, this world is like I said, super fascinating. So I love writing more in it and getting to new platforms. And like I said, going on a trip to IO and what that's like, how the relationship is between the main planet and the moon. Thinking more, I think a lot more about the university. The university has, I think, in the first book we talk a lot about the modern and classical departments. There's also a speculative department, and that gets more play in the second book, which is really fun. So there's that. Book 3, as I've mentioned it a lot that I'm working on it. I should say it's not contracted yet, but hopefully hopefully one will do well and they'll buy 3 as well. So, and that's also, I'm not going to say too much as it's very early, but again, just trying to push out to different places in the world, trying to push out to different places in the relationship while having a self-contained mystery that's interesting and fun, hopefully. So yeah, that's for them. And in the meantime, I have short stories and a bunch of different anthologies that are coming out this year, and you have my back catalog there as well.
Yeah, the everybody, if you've tuned into this and you've enjoyed listening to Malka talk about this world and how much fun it is and how classic this feels, everybody go out and get The Mimicking of Known Successes. It is a brilliant novella, and it's a joy to read. So yeah, let's go get book 1 so we can make book 3 happen for Malka. That would be brilliant. Malka, just thank you for joining me and for being here. Can you let everybody know where they can find you?
Yeah, as long as Twitter lasts and is bearable, I rant on there a lot. My handle is at @m_older. I'm also on Mastodon at older at wandering.shop. I am at Infomocracy on Instagram, although I don't use it that much yet. You can pretty much find me using my name. I also have a WordPress site, which I try to keep updated, especially with new publications. So that's a great place to check if you want to read. I have lots of short stuff that's available free online in various journals and publications. So yeah, right now on social media, I'm doing a long thread about the book, The Pushcart War, because I love it. And I think it's a great manual for collective action and a fascinating kind of speculative fiction. So check that out if you have any interest. And otherwise, yeah, look for my books.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Malka.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.